Imagine you have just ascended the throne after a protracted war for the empire. In your hands lie an army, tax collectors, and the right to execute anyone in the city square. Your laws are recited from the pulpits, and the treasury is filled at your first request. But in the reports of spies, an unpleasant truth emerges. Beneath the cities under your control lies another, lower world, where rivers of invisible goods flow, autonomous water is concealed, and salt is extracted that yields more gold than all your taxes combined. These underground networks belong to ancient guilds and bankers who are independent of your graces and armies. If they control water and strategic resources without your knowledge, they can easily buy themselves another ruler, or simply wait out your siege underground. With a single decree, you could declare all mineral resources to be imperial property and order their immense autonomous bases to be referred to in documents as mere taverns, erasing any memory of their true power. What will you choose? To admit that real power in the cities does not belong to you, but rather to the lords of the underworld, or to strip them of their political status, turning a complex infrastructure of control into innocuous storage buildings for barrels? Now, let's see how this played out in real history. Imagine living in a city where beneath every building lies another city, with its own streets, boundaries, warehouses, and secret corridors, with its own rules, its own owners, its own logic. And this lower city never slept. It operated in parallel with the upper one, only without lights, without market cries, without witnesses. You will be shown maps of medieval German cities and told, here are the streets, here are the squares, here are the cathedrals. But if you lower your gaze just a bit below the level of the pavement, the picture changes completely. Because the real power in these cities belonged not to those who walked above, but to those who controlled what lay beneath. Today, tourists are shown beer cellars and historical dungeons. Guides talk about medieval warehouses and the care of townsfolk for the freshness of beverages. It sounds cozy and understandable. But when you start looking at the numbers, the depth, volume, technology, legal protection of these spaces, the cozy narrative starts to crack. Because beer warehouses do not require mountain engineering. They do not need autonomous wells. They do not need stone boundary markers at 10 meters deep. They do not need acoustic resonators. Where all of this exists, there was a different function. Let's explore this together. Let's take the city of Gera in Thuringia, a typical German city like hundreds of others. A town hall, a church, a market, houses, everything as it should be. Now imagine that beneath this entirely understandable picture lies a system of 250 deep cellars with a total length of 9 kilometers. But that's not all. To access these cellars, called Höhle, you first need to enter the regular basement of a residential building, open a hatch in the floor, and descend even further. A basement beneath a basement. A second bottom. Literally. The official version is simple and convenient. These are beer warehouses. The residents of Gera loved beer. Suitable storage conditions were needed, so they dug. It sounds reasonable, until you start counting. Look at the dates. 75% of the entire system, almost 7 kilometers out of 9, was dug over the course of 50 years. 50. Now ask yourself, who did this? The answer is preserved in the city archives. When the copper and silver veins in Kara ran out, that is, when mining came to an end, Professional miners were neither laid off nor expelled from the city. They were redirected to construct beer cellars. Do you hear that detail? Professional mining engineers with experience in underground drilling were left to dig storage for beer. Many will think, so what? They just found a use for ready-made specialists. Okay, but then explain one thing. The mining method of excavation is fundamentally different from building an ordinary cellar. Miners knew how to work in unstable soils, how to support the rock, how to build a ventilation system at great depths. They didn't need these skills for storing beer. It was enough to dig a pit, shore up the walls with bricks, and make a good lid. Beer does not require mining engineering, but here they specifically used it. And this is no coincidence. It is a choice in favor of depth, in favor of durability, in favor of a system that will endure for more than 1 century. 3 levels down, 8 to 12 meters below the surface. The temperature is stable, 8 to 12 degrees. Among the lower tiers, 2 wells were found, autonomous, operating independently of the city's water supply. This is a nail. Why does a brewery storage facility need an independent water supply not connected to the city's networks? Beer is stored, not produced, in a cellar. The water for it is taken from above. But here, the water was underground, separate, isolated, inaccessible for external control. This is not a brewery with excesses. This is an autonomous unit with independent life support. What it was needed for remains an open question, but the fact remains. Under the city of Hera, there existed a system that could operate without the upper city at all. Look at what happens next as we move 140 kilometers westward. Zeitz, Saxony-Anhalt, a small town with a beautiful name and, as it turns out, very nervous basement owners. In the cellars beneath the upper town, at depths of 6 to 12 meters, stone slabs have been preserved. They seem ordinary at first glance, but if you take a closer look, you can see markings on them. These are boundary stones, not on the surface, but underground. At a depth of 10 meters, in the darkness where no one can see them, someone carefully delineated the territory between neighboring plots. You have house number 5 on Fish Street, and the neighbor has number 6. This boundary between you runs along the surface, a fence perhaps, or just an imaginary line. But in Zeitz, this same boundary was drawn underground, at the level of the cellar, with a stone marker, officially. This is not an informal agreement between neighbors. It is a legally established boundary, which means the underground space was official property, registered, divided, and protected just like the surface land. At first glance, it seems like mere pedantry of medieval burghers, accustomed to formalizing everything according to law. But think about it. To maintain a register of underground property, an administration was required. An official who surveyed the cellars with measuring tools drew up documents and affixed seals. Someone kept a record of the underground cadastre. Someone else ensured that no one violated the boundaries below. This is not a domestic practice. It is a state mechanism situated underground. And here's the question that follows. Who adjudicated the disputes? If you have a cadastral record, it means there are violations. Someone is breaking through a wall in the wrong place. Someone is expanding their cellar at the expense of their neighbor's space. In an above-ground city, such disputes were resolved by the municipal court, publicly, with official records. But in sites, a dispute over an underground boundary meant that the judge had to descend to a depth of 10 meters by candlelight, with documents to verify the position of the boundary marker. The existence of this procedure indicates that underground property was seriously protected, not as a curiosity, but as a legitimate right. This is not about cellars. It's a separate legal regime that operated parallel to the above-ground city. And here is a detail that adds a completely different shade to this picture. While clearing out the underground passages in the 90s of the last century, workers discovered routes leading directly to the bank vaults, not to the modern structures of the 20th century, but to vaults embedded in the very architecture of the system. A structure created 7 centuries ago has survived into the 20th century without any change in topography. 7 centuries. The same pathways, the same boundaries, the same logic. This is not just a storage place. It is an infrastructure with such durability that it has been reused generation after generation without even considering reconstruction. Now for something important. If in Gera there was an autonomous system with independent water supply beneath the city, and in Zaita there was an underground cadastre with legally defined borders, then a logical question arises. Where did they store what was valued more than beer and required stricter protection than a regular warehouse? The answer is in Merseburg. Merseburg, Saxony-Anhalt. At first glance, it appears to be a typical medieval town on the great trade route Via Regia, the main trade artery of Europe. It stood at the crossroads of flows, silver and furs coming from the east, cloth and spices from the west. Merseburg served as a kind of customs gateway, and beneath it lies more than 400 documented chambers descending down 4 levels. 400 rooms. Stop and do a simple calculation. Take the population of Merseburg in the 13th to 15th centuries. According to historical estimates, it was between 3,000 to 5,000 people. Divide the 400 underground rooms by the number of residents. It amounts to roughly 1 room for every 10 to 12 people. This is not a city refrigerator for perishable goods. This volume is incompatible with domestic needs. Historians typically explain this through transit. They say that Merseburg was located on a trade route, and merchants stored their goods there. It sounds logical, but then answer the following. A regular transit warehouse is built on the surface, near the road, for easy loading and unloading. Here, there are 4 levels deep into the ground. The lowest level is 7.5 meters below the surface. Lowering goods down there and bringing them back up requires extra work, extra time, and extra people. Why do that when you could simply place the warehouse next to the city gates? Unless, of course, you don't want that merchandise to be seen. During the excavation of the lower levels, a functioning well was discovered. Again, an autonomous water supply, unrelated to surface systems. And another feature that is hard to explain with ordinary logic. In Merseburg, the oldest basements are on top, while the younger ones are below them. The city has been dug into the earth layer by layer. Each generation added another level downward, as if what was stored here demanded greater depth, greater isolation from the surface. The city grew downward just as insistently as other cities grew upward. This chronological direction is evidence in itself. The usual logic is that construction starts from the bottom, digging deep first, and then filling in the upper levels as needed, from bottom to top, like building floors. In Merseburg, it is the opposite. Earlier layers are on top, while later ones are deeper. This means that with each generation, the demands for insulation grew. What was sufficiently concealed in the 13th century, at a depth of 2 meters, was no longer considered adequate in the 15th century. Deeper was required, further away from the surface. The reason for this increasing demand is not documented, but the mere fact of the growth is documented in the physical structure of the system, layer by layer, level by level. In 1976, a portion of the buildings above this complex collapsed. The ground had sunk due to voids that the builders of the 20th century were simply unaware of. 400 rooms across 4 levels turned out to be such a surprise for contemporaries that they literally fell into the past. 3 cities, 3 different technical solutions, 1 logic. Where a simple hole with a lid would suffice, they employed the mining method. Where a mere verbal agreement was enough, they placed a stone boundary marker 10 meters deep. Where a single level would do, they dug 4. Such redundancy is never accidental. It comes at a cost. Therefore, someone was paying, and knew why. But money and goods are just one level of control. There is something more interesting. Cologne, 1890. 7 meters beneath the street. Imagine descending an iron staircase into the darkness, and suddenly a hall opens up before you. Not just a technical sewer collector made of concrete and pipes. A hall with Gothic ribbed vaults, with ancient coats of arms on the walls, and with 2 chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, in a sewage collector. This is the Kronleuchtersaal, the chandelier hall. Officially, it's the merging point of 2 major sewage flows. During heavy rains, the hall is completely flooded with wastewater that is discharged into the Rhine. 99% of the time, this place is seen only by rats and filth. Yet someone, back in 1890, spent a significant portion of the city budget on Gothic vaults, heraldry, and lighting fixtures in a space that almost no one ever visits. The standard explanation is that the hall was constructed for the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm II to showcase the triumph of German engineering to the monarch. Hygiene, order, and technical progress were all important political messages of the era. It was the first sewage system since the times of Rome, and Cologne wanted to boast about it. Okay, but look at the scale. The height of the arch is 4 meters 60 centimeters. 3 pipes converge into a single node at a perfectly calculated angle. The geometry of the intersection creates an acoustic resonator. The sound in this hall spreads according to the principles usually applied to concert halls, not to sewage pipes. Jazz concerts are held here today. Tickets are sold out a year in advance. The acoustics are phenomenal. Question: who calculated the acoustics of the sewage collector in 1890? This is not a coincidence of geometry. 3 pipes at specific angles, a vault of specific curvature, a height of a specific value. This is calculation. But why calculate the acoustics of a structure designed for waste? If we assume that this hall was initially conceived not only as a point of convergence for different streams, but also as a space where meetings should take place, then everything falls into place. A place where random people do not enter. A place that officially exists, but is, in fact, inaccessible. a place with its own symbolism, its own acoustics, and its own special status. A hall where power could converse with power without witnesses. In 1890, it remains unknown who exactly commissioned the chandeliers, the Kaiser or the mayor. This question has remained unanswered in the city archives, which is itself unusual for an era when bureaucratic documentation was already quite advanced. Look at how the form of an object becomes an indication. In typical logic, a utilitarian object is built functionally, no unnecessary aesthetics. But if the object carries a dual function, if its official version serves as a cover for another, then aesthetics appear as a signal. This is a place of special status. The emblem on the wall of the sewer is not decoration. It is a marker. This hall belongs to someone specific. Now take a closer look at the coats of arms. Heraldry in the medieval and early modern tradition is not just decoration. It is an identifier of the owner. On the walls of the Kronleuchtersaal are the shields of guilds and city families. This means the hall was symbolically divided among specific groups. Each coat of arms is a statement of the right to be present. In the year 1890, when the hall was built, this heraldic tradition was already archaic. No one hung guild coats of arms on new industrial buildings. Yet here they were hung. This is a deliberate reference to the old code. The architect of the hall understood this code and knew that it would be recognized by those for whom the hall was intended. The audience that comes here can read heraldry like a language. Now, to the most unexpected story in this entire collection. Schwandorf, Upper Palatinate, the year 1380. The first tunnels in iron sandstone. Over 5 centuries, the city accumulates more than 130 private cellars. Isolated, dispersed. Each belongs to its owner, each separated from the neighboring one by a wall. No common system, just individual storage spaces beneath separate houses. And so, we arrive at the year 1931. The archives record, thieves begin methodically breaking through the walls between private cellars. One breach. Second. Third. A year of work, and a single corridor stretches underground throughout the city. What the city authorities could not achieve in 500 years of negotiations and agreements, uniting private underground spaces into a single network, criminals managed in 12 months. They simply took it upon themselves to break the walls down. In 1945, on the night of April 16th to 17th, this network saved 6,000 people. When bombers appeared over Schwandorf, the entire population descended into the tunnels created by criminals 13 years earlier. The system, which was once an infrastructure of crime, became the command center for the mayor, a field hospital, and a shelter for the townspeople all at once. For context, in 1861, these cellars held 735,000 liters of beer, to illustrate the scale of the system. But the real paradox lies elsewhere. Official urban planning was unable to unite what thieves managed to consolidate in a year over the course of 500 years. What does this say about the nature of power in the city? Formally, power resided with the town hall. But real control over the underground space belonged to those who didn't ask for permission, to those who simply took action and did. What exactly was moving through these breaches in the year 31, during a period of acute unemployment and just before the Nazis came to power? Archives present vague formulations. Smuggling, unlisted goods, persons without documents. In early 1930s Germany, each of these definitions could mean very different things, depending on who was hiding. A network of thieves, formed out of greed, ultimately had a structure that could function like any other invisible system, for everything that was not meant to emerge to the surface. This is the principle of dual use in its purest form. Infrastructure knows no morality. It only knows physics. And here arises a question that is hard to ignore. If beneath each of these cities there existed a parallel system, with its own rules, its own logic, its own owners, then who actually governed the city? The one who sat in the town hall and enacted laws from above? Or the one who controlled the flows, the spaces, and the information below? Now let's move on to the objects where underground control was not over money or symbolism, but over the city itself. Literally. Lüneburg, Lower Saxony. Year 956, the Charter of Otto I. Salt. This word in the Middle Ages meant roughly the same as oil does today, a resource controlling the economy of entire regions. Lüneburg supplied salt to the entire Hanseatic League, Scandinavia, and Russia.
At the height of its prosperity, 54 saltworks, 216 pans, up to 11,900 tons of dry salt per year. But the salt was not extracted through mining here. Beneath the city lies a salt dome that begins at a depth of 40 meters. Brine was pumped up with pumps, brought to the surface, and boiled in huge vats. The technology was called grating. The brine was first concentrated by passing it through wooden structures with thorn bushes to evaporate some of the water, and only then was it boiled. It was a complex industrial chain, and the technology of the Sulfmeister, the Salt Kings, was guarded more strictly than state secrets. No outsiders were allowed into the production area. There was no documentation available for external audits. Now look at what this extraction has done to the city itself. The evaporation process required an immense amount of firewood. So much forest was cut down that the Lüneburg Heath was created. An entire landscape was destroyed as a byproduct of the production process. This happened slowly, over decades, and no one intervened. But this is only the visible part of the destruction. Meanwhile, something else was happening beneath the city. When brine is pumped out from the salt dome, voids form in the rock. Gradually, indiscernibly, until the ground beneath one's feet begins to sink. This process began long ago in Lüneburg, but by the 20th century, it had turned into a disaster. Between the years 1951 and 1980, over 180 historical buildings were demolished due to ground subsidence. In some areas, the city center has sunk by several meters. Senkungsgebiet, the subsidence area, still exists as a distinct district, with houses standing at impossible angles, with crooked doorways and cracks in the pavement. Remember this number: 180 demolished buildings. This is not a natural disaster or an earthquake. This is the consequence of a conscious decision to continue extraction, knowing that voids were forming beneath the city. The documents have survived. The authorities were aware of the ground subsidence and continued to issue permits for extraction because the revenue from salt was more important, because the salt merchants were wealthier than the city hall, because those who controlled the resource beneath the city ultimately controlled the city itself, including the decision of whether it would stand or collapse. Ask yourself, how is such a decision made? Who sits on the council and says, "Yes, we will continue," knowing that buildings will start to collapse? The answer is straightforward. Those who profit from extraction more than they lose from the collapse. The Salt Kings of Lüneburg were wealthier than any rulers in the region. They funded churches, bridges, hospitals. They were the city. and the city literally sank underground while they counted their profits. The first water supply system in Germany, year 1338, was also built with the money of salt magnates. Control over water from above and control over extraction from below. Two streams, both in the hands of one group of people. This is called an infrastructure monopoly, and Lüneburg demonstrates how it works in practice. When a resource is more important than the city submits to the resource. But the scale of this monopoly extended far beyond a single city. The Hanseatic trade agreements of the 14th and 15th centuries explicitly stated that Lüneburg salt was a prerequisite for fishing in the Baltic Sea. Without salt, herring cannot be preserved. Without preserved herring, there is no food security in Scandinavia and the Baltic states. This meant that the Sulfmeister of Lüneburg, a few families controlling the extraction from a specific salt dome beneath one German city, held the food balance of an entire region of Europe in their hands. The fleets of fishermen, the winter reserves of port cities, the trade routes of the Hanse, all of these relied on what was happening underground in Lüneburg, and the cities of Lübeck, Hamburg, and Rostock, which were formerly far and independent, were well aware of this dependency. But salt united them with Lüneburg more strongly than any treaty. It was control over the economy and territory. But there is another level, more subtle and therefore more sinister: control over information. Erfurt, Thuringia, 17th century. The citadel of Petersburg is one of the few completely preserved Baroque fortresses in Europe. Inside its massive ramparts, embedded within several meters of masonry, lies a network of tunnels. They are called Horchgänge, listening passages. Their official function: countermining defense. The soldiers of the garrison were to stay in these passages and listen, literally pressing their ear to the wall, to determine whether the enemy was mining beneath the fortress's foundation. Find the layout of the Petersburg fortress. Look at the geometry of the tunnels. There are no simple straight paths from point A to point B. There are branches, dead ends, chambers with unique wall configurations, sharp turns. These are not tunnels for movement. This is not a countermining network in the conventional sense. Such systems are usually simpler and more straightforward. This is a system designed to work with sound. Here is what researchers studying the fortress have documented. The tunnels allowed the commandant to hear not only potential digging from the outside, but also conversations inside the fortress. At certain points in the system, sound from different parts of the garrison converged in one place. The commandant could be at the central post and hear what was happening at the gates, in the kitchen, and in the barracks, simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. The acoustic properties of these tunnels were studied by specialists, and they confirm that the geometry was designed specifically for sound transmission, not for the movement of people. At the same time, the tunnels provided officers with the opportunity to move between the bastions, between the fortifications named Johann, Franz, Kilian, and Martin, while remaining unseen. Neither by the enemy outside, nor by their own soldiers. The commander could appear at any point in the fortress unexpectedly, without warning, bypassing anyone who might notice him. This is not just convenience. It is a tool for psychological control. And this is what made the system particularly effective. Everyone was aware of the existence of the listening tunnels. The garrison knew that the walls were listening. The citizens of Erfurt knew that the fortress had ears. This knowledge was in itself a weapon, perhaps more powerful than the acoustic system itself. When a person knows they might be heard, they begin to self-censor. They don't need supervision every minute. Just the possibility of supervision is enough. The commandant could go weeks without entering the tunnels, yet the fortress remained under control. Invisible oversight is more effective than visible. Now, let's add two objects to the picture that represent the extreme points of this system. Bamberg, Upper Franconia. Beneath the hills of the city lies a network of tunnels extending about 12 kilometers, but not in the usual sense of caverns. This is an industrial extraction site in Kuiper sandstone, descending to depths of up to 70 meters, the height of a 20-story building, underground. Officially, it is the extraction of cleaning sand for floors and copper, as well as storage of beer. In the 17th century, when the tunnels began to be actively used by brewers, the temperature there consistently remained at 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. But in one of the chambers, human remains from the 15th century were found. They are linked to the plague epidemics. The dungeons were used as a sanitary barrier, a place where those who could not be buried within the city limits were taken. This changes the status of the site. It is no longer just a storage space, but rather a threshold between the living and those hazardous to the living. In the years 1944 to 1945, the tunnels beneath Mount Stephansberg became a production site for Bosch, manufacturing electrical equipment for aviation. To this day, remnants of frames and wiring are found there. 12 kilometers of medieval passages embraced the industrial production of the 20th century. An object that was 7 centuries old turned out to be strong and deep enough to support military industry. This is the reserve strength that is not considered when constructing a simple warehouse. Between Bamberg and Nuremberg lies a site that I can't miss: Mendig, Rhineland-Palatinate. Beneath this small town are the lava halls of the Wingertsberg volcano. The basalt here is 200,000 years old. The Celts mined it for millstones. The Romans extracted it for construction. Millstones made from Mendig basalt can be found throughout Western Europe, from Britain to Egypt, indicating that extraction here has been on an industrial scale for millennia. However, documents from the 18th century refer to underground mining as already having established halls. The records indicate not the construction, but the utilization of what already existed. When exactly 3 square kilometers of voids were carved out at a depth of 32 meters remains unknown. In 1843, the first brewery lowered its barrels into these halls. It was followed by 27 others. Brewers quickly understood that the porous basalt and constant humidity ranging from 70 to 90% created an ideal microclimate. The temperature in the halls remains unchanged both in summer and winter. Beer in oak barrels at a depth of 32 meters matured differently than on the surface. The evaporation through the wood's pores was minimal. This was a controlled environment that modern technology struggles to replicate, and at a great cost. There were 160 vertical shafts leading to the halls, directly from the yards and homes above them. Each property owner had direct access to the underground. One could lower goods in their yard and raise them in a neighboring one, without stepping out onto the street, without witnesses. 160 shafts. This is not just a couple of secret entrances. It's a network that spans the entire city. The vaults are supported by columns left by workers every 6 to 8 meters. Reliability was tested by a single method: a hammer strike on the basalt. A dull sound indicates stability. A ringing sound signifies a risk of collapse. 3 square kilometers of voids have adhered to this principle for several centuries. Not a single collapse. This means that the workers understood the rock better than most formal engineers. Today, the halls of Mendiga are filmed for fantasy movies. The basalt columns stretch into the darkness. The humid air hangs motionless. This place looks like something that was found rather than created. And that's what troubles. Where did 3 square kilometers of void come from? And where has all the excavated basalt gone? Nuremberg provides the final and most telling example of how the official narrative unfolds under the pressure of specific details. November 11th, 1380. The first documented decree regarding beer cellars in southern Germany. According to this law, anyone who brews beer is required to have a cellar that is 10 feet deep and 16 feet wide. It sounds like a private initiative regulated by a common standard. Each brewer has their own cellar. Private property, private responsibility. But here's a detail that textbooks don't explain. The town hall didn't just allow digging basements. It established a strict requirement. The supports of the lower levels must be placed directly under the supports of the upper ones. Violations of depth or width were not the only offenses punished. Discrepancies in the load-bearing elements on different levels were also penalized. This means one thing. The town hall was controlling a unified structural system, not just a collection of individual cellars. Someone in the year 1380 viewed the dungeons of Nuremberg not as separate storage spaces, but as a single engineering organism. And beneath all of this lies a secret aqueduct. Lochwasserleitung. While the townspeople relied on wells and depended on the city's water supply, narrow tunnels, up to 60 centimeters wide, ran beneath the beer cellars, carrying water for the city's elite. The existence of this network was kept hidden from the public until the mid-17th century. For 270 years, the secret aqueduct operated beneath the public system. For 270 years, some townspeople drank from wells, while others drank from a separate pipe, of which the former had no knowledge. Consider this difference. A public well in a medieval city is a place of queues, conversations, and observation of one another. A place where you can see how much water each person takes, who is sick, who is poor, who has a house on fire. An informational hub. Those who had access to a private water pipe completely exited this system of observation. Their daily life became invisible. Their household became independent. It was not just a matter of comfort, it was an escape from urban control over the most fundamental function, access to water. When a fire broke out in the city and everyone rushed to the wells, someone's water flowed through a private pipe underground and no one knew about it. 25,000 square meters, 4 tiers, up to 20 meters deep, a stable temperature of 8 to 12 degrees. Ice mines, Kohldome, vertical shafts running through all floors where ice was lowered to maintain the cold. In 1945, these spaces housed 40,000 people, double the calculated capacity. An art bunker at a depth of 24 meters, equipped with climate control, preserved masterpieces by Dürer and the Golden Bull. A structure built in the 14th century for brewing beer proved strong enough in the 20th century to withstand aerial bombings. Now put it all together. Hera, Zeitz, Merseburg, Cologne, Schwandorf, Lüneburg, Erfurt, Bamberg, Nuremberg. 9 different cities, different regions, different eras of construction, different official functions, but a single logic, 3 layers of control. The first is economic. Goods move underground, bypassing customs, taxes, and trade registries. A parallel flow of wealth, invisible to the official administration. In Zeitz, there is an underground cadastre. In Merseburg, 400 transit rooms for goods that were not meant to enter the market. In Nuremberg, a secret aqueduct as a privilege inaccessible to most citizens. The second layer is symbolic. The form of objects signals status. Gothic arches and chandeliers in the Cologne sewers are not decoration, they are markers of belonging. A place becomes significant not when it is talked about, but when it is known to be talked about in silence. The third layer is informational and physical. Resource and sound as weapons of control. Whoever holds the salt dome of Lüneburg literally decides whether the city stands or sinks. Whoever controls the acoustic passages of Erfurt hears what others consider to be whispered words. These are not just isolated curiosities. This is a system with a unified logic. And the most alarming question is not what was stored beneath these cities. It's who set the standards. Because there were clearly standards in place. In Zeitz, stone boundary markers at a depth of 10 meters, legally precise.
In Nuremberg, the building regulations of 1380, which govern the accuracy of alignment of supports at different levels. In Gera, mining engineering, where a shovel would have sufficed. In Merseburg, 4 levels down where 1 would have been enough. The redundancy is not accidental. It repeats too often to be a coincidence. We are used to thinking of medieval power as a simple vertical hierarchy: king, baron, merchant, peasant. A hierarchy that is visible and understandable. But what if beneath each city there was another hierarchy, horizontal, invisible, unrecorded in official chronicles? Who were its participants? The miners in Gera worked not for the mayor, but for whoever hired them to dig the second levels. The salt kings of Lüneburg financed the infrastructure that the town hall could not control. The criminals of Schwandorf created a cohesive network faster than any official structure. The commandant of Erfurt heard through the walls what his officers believed was said in the dark. If this was a system, and the signs point to exactly that, then it must have had people who designed it, not just builders. People with shared principles, unified standards, common goals. Who were they? Their names do not appear in official chronicles. Their decisions do exist. They are etched in stone, 10 meters deep, in the darkness where no one was meant to see them. In 1983, in Oppenheim, yet another German town with a population of 3,000, a police car fell through the asphalt, into a forgotten void of which no one knew. Beneath this small town, there are 40 kilometers of tunnels, 5 levels down. The temperature is 17 degrees, unusually warm for the underground. And the system lives its own life, not aligning with the surface plan of the town. In 1689, the French burned Oppenheim to the ground. The new town was rebuilt, and new houses were constructed without reference to the old catacombs. The upper town has changed. The lower town has not. It continues to exist in the same coordinates, in the same topography, in the same logic. A system not tied to a terrestrial plan. A structure living by its own coordinates. This is not a warehouse beneath a house. This is a state within a state. There are technical details that are overlooked in the main cases, and it is in them that the mechanics of the entire system are hidden. In the hollows of Hera, 80% of the rock is river deposits, and 19% is dolomite. This was not a random choice of route. The builders knew the geology beneath the city precisely,
and laid the tunnels through specific layers, those that hold their shape without supports. Today, such work requires drilling samples and geological maps. In the 16th century, it was done based on experience that was passed down from miner to miner in the shafts. And it was this expertise in reading the land that someone deemed necessary under the streets of the city where beer was brewed. Moreover, there are no visible ventilation towers in the Hellers, but the temperature is stable and the air is breathable. This means there was ventilation, just hidden, inconspicuous channels emerging in unremarkable places on the surface. A technology that deliberately conceals itself from the outside. The object must remain invisible to those walking above. This is not a coincidence of design. It is a design requirement. 70 meters. That's the distance from the surface to the very deepest level of the shafts. 70 meters down. That's a 20-story building. Now think about the logistics. To extract sand at such depth and bring it to the surface in the 14th and 15th centuries, lifting mechanisms were needed. Manual winches, ropes, baskets. The productivity of such a system is extremely low. One person per shift can lift only a few hundred kilograms of material under ideal conditions. To profitably extract the cleaning sand, which in Bamberg was called Scheuersand, at a depth of 70 meters, this sand would have had to be very expensive. Otherwise, the economics doesn't add up. The cost of labor for lifting exceeds the cost of the product. The Bamberg Scheuersand was indeed valued, but not enough to justify 70 meters of vertical extraction. This narrow bottleneck is not explained by the official version. It means that the depth was not needed for extracting sand. The depth was the goal. 70 meters of isolation from the surface is not a side effect. It is a requirement. And here arises a theory that is difficult to verify, but even harder to dismiss. If we look at these cities not as separate phenomena, but as nodes of a single system, what kind of system is it? It has unified construction standards. There is a single logic of dual purpose, the official function as a cover for another. There is legal protection of underground space through cadastre and regulations. There is infrastructural control over resources, water in Nuremberg, salt in Lüneburg. There is information control through acoustics. And there is temporal stability. All of this was built to withstand changes of ownership, changes of power, changes of eras. These are signs of not spontaneous grassroots self-organization. They are signs of design. Someone was sitting and thinking, how can I create a system that will function independently of who is currently in power at the top? How can I ensure that control over real flows, money, water, information, remains in one set of hands, even when mayors and dukes change? Answer: to place control underground. To a place where the official authority does not look. To a place it cannot reach without specialized knowledge of what actually exists there. But there is a question that is almost never asked. Who paid for all of this? City treasury? No. The Nuremberg Regulation of 1380 governed private construction. Each brewer built at their own expense. The salt infrastructure of Lüneburg was funded by Sulfmeister, private families, not the town hall. The mining engineers in Gera were not city employees. They were managed by the same mining companies that operated the mines. In Merseburg, 400 underground chambers appeared along the trade route, where the main players were merchant associations, not the city administration. This means that the underground system did not belong to the city. It belonged to specific individuals, those who had access to capital, to mining specialists, and to legal tools for property protection. This is the key shift. The City Hall wrote the laws, but the laws safeguarded someone else's infrastructure. The official authority created a legal framework for a system that it did not own or control. This scheme has a specific name. Augsburg, early 16th century. The Fugger family, the largest banking house in Europe at that time, held underground warehouses beneath their quarter in the city center. The documents have been preserved. Part of the Augsburg canals and cellars were listed as the property of the Fuggers, not the city. Moreover, the same Fuggers lent money to Emperor Maximilian, financed papal wars, and managed mining concessions throughout Central Europe. Their name appears in the financial documents of half the German cities of that period. People who simultaneously owned underground warehouses in Augsburg, mining enterprises in Tyrol, and debt notes from monarchs are not local merchants. This is a system, with unified management, with a coherent logic of resource control, top-down and bottom-up. And here is the legal instrument that ensured this system: Bergregal, the mining regalia. According to imperial law, all mineral resources in Germany belonged to the emperor, theoretically. In practice, he transferred the right to exploit specific areas to certain families through concessions. These concessions were hereditary, traded as securities, and protected by imperial courts. This meant that a private individual who received Bergregel for a plot beneath the city had stronger legal rights to what was underground than the city council had to what was above it. The city hall could enact any laws, but it could not touch the underground concession without the consent of the holder and without appealing to the imperial court. The underground Germany operated under a different legal regime than the surface, and this regime deliberately protected the owners from the interference of local authorities. Now, to the material that hides beneath the official versions at the level of construction techniques. Let's start with a question of time. In the Hera, 75% of the system was excavated over 50 years. That sounds like a long time, but let's translate that into numbers. 9 kilometers in total length. 75% is 6,750 meters. Over 50 years. That means 135 meters per year, 11 meters per month, less than half a meter per day. Seemingly, it's not much. However, the tunnel isn't dug in just one spot. Work is carried out simultaneously in several areas. This means that multiple teams were working at the same time. Therefore, there was coordination. Who goes where the paths would meet, how to avoid breaking into someone else's cellar or the foundation of a neighboring house. Coordinating underground construction in the 16th century was not a trivial task. It required surveyors, experts in underground geodesy. Such specialists existed in mining. Without them, it is impossible to drive two workings towards each other and meet at a single point. In Gera, it was indeed the mining engineers who built the hollows. They brought with them surveying expertise. Thus, someone made the decision. We need a coordinated underground system, not just a collection of isolated shafts. This decision was made before the construction began. This is a project, not a spontaneous process. Here is a small artisanal detail that confirms this. In Hera's hallowed halls, the vaults are made of river stone, the very dolomite that comprises 80% of the rock. However, laying the vaults requires precise marking. The stones must support each other through the geometry of the arch, not through mortar. If the arch is incorrect, the vault collapses. This is called wedge-shaped masonry, and it requires templates, wooden structures that define the shape of the vault during construction and are later removed. Without such templates, special tools, and knowledge of angles, the vault cannot be constructed. This is a skill passed down from master to apprentice over many years. Not every stonemason is capable of building underground vaults. This is a narrow specialization. In Gera, it was applied in 250 objects. 250 times, someone created a proper vault underground. This is not a one-time effort by an enthusiast. It's a production. And here is the question that follows from this. Who passed down the skills? Stacked masonry, surveyor calculations, reading rock layers by tactile sensations. None of this can be found in books. In late medieval Germany, there existed an organization specifically for this purpose, Knappschaft, a brotherhood of miners. Formally, it was a mutual aid fund and a trade union uniting miners and mining engineers. Informally, it was a closed corporation with its own rituals, distinctive symbols of belonging, and strict control over who had access to professional knowledge. In the mining regions of Saxony, Thuringia, and Bohemia, Knappschaft has been documented since the 13th century.
When the miners of Gera ceased extracting ore and began digging holes, they did not stop being members of Knappschaft. They brought with them a structure, a hierarchy, and a technological bank accumulated over generations. This explains how 250 vaults in various parts of the city were built to a single standard, not because there was a unified architectural plan, but because there was a single professional code. Let's move on to Oppenheim, a city that I mentioned in passing, but which deserves a separate analysis. Oppenheim, Rhineland-Palatinate, flourishing in the 14th to 17th centuries. 40 kilometers of tunnels in loose soil, 5 levels. A city with a population, at its peak, of about 3,000 people. Stop at this proportion. 40 kilometers is the distance from the center of a large city to its suburbs. It's the subway route from one end to the other, under a town with 3,000 inhabitants. This is physically incompatible with the logic of storing goods for the local market. Even if every resident of Oppenheim kept a year's worth of supplies, 40 kilometers of tunnels are excessive by hundreds of times. Official explanation: staple right. Merchants passing through Oppenheim were required to display their goods for sale in the town. To hide part of their goods from the inspectors, they would store them in cellars. This is the version regarding the economic offshore. It partially explains the existence of tunnels, but it does not account for the 40 kilometers. To conceal goods from customs control, just a few reliable cameras are enough. 40 kilometers of an extensive network is already a logistics infrastructure. This is a system designed not for hiding, but for movement, for the transportation of something, or someone, through the entire city underground. And here is a detail that speaks of the builder's intentions more accurately than any documents. The Oppenheim tunnels were excavated in less, a special type of less-like clay typical of the Rhine Valley. Less can be easily cut by hand, does not require blasting, and does not collapse when the excavation profile is done correctly. The builders knew precisely that it was in less that a long network could be created without expensive reinforcements. However, less does not hold water, so the tunnels remain dry naturally. This is not a random material. It is a site choice considering the geology. This means that before construction began, someone studied the soil. Someone decided to build precisely here, in this way, and with 5 levels. Not because it was easier, but because it was here that what was intended could be achieved. In 1689, French troops burned down Oppenheim. The above-ground city was reduced to ashes. Then it was rebuilt, but no longer connected to the old underground tunnels. New houses rose in one area, while the old tunnels remained in another. The upper plan of the city and the lower plan diverged. This meant that by the end of the 17th century, the residents of Oppenheim no longer knew exactly what lay beneath their feet. The memory of the system was lost, along with the old city. But the system remained. But Erfurt has a dimension that was previously overlooked. The auditory passages of Petersburg were not built in peacetime. The 30 Years' War had just ended. The German states were experiencing a deep divide. Erfurt was under the authority of the Mainz Archbishopric, an external power that the citizens did not trust. The garrison did not trust the population. Officers did not trust the soldiers. And in this environment, someone made the decision to invest money, post-war, scarce funds, not in new barracks or the repair of fortifications, but in an acoustic system. This was a matter of prioritization. Information security was valued more than physical security. And here's what is important from a chronological perspective. Most German underground systems were built precisely during periods of instability: the Reformation, peasant uprisings, religious wars. This is not a coincidence. When the upper world is shaken, they build below. The infrastructure hidden underground serves as a form of insurance, not against a specific threat, but against a change in the rules of the game as a whole. Now, the final block. About what all this means as a system, rather than as a collection of separate examples. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a free city, freie Stadt, existed. Nuremberg and Augsburg achieved the right to self-governance through payments to the emperor and the demonstration of economic self-sufficiency. But behind this demonstration lay something concrete: an autonomous underground aqueduct, inaccessible to external enemies, reserves hidden from tax inspectors, shelters in case of siege. The underground infrastructure was a political argument. It materialized independence, transforming it from a declaration into a physical fact, buried 20 meters in the ground. A city with such a system could communicate with the emperor differently. Not grant us rights, but try to take what belongs to us. It worked on both sides of the negotiating table. When in 1473, Nuremberg found itself in conflict with the Margrave of Brandenburg, the city withstood the siege not only due to its walls. The underground aqueduct provided water no matter who controlled the rivers outside. Supplies in the cellars allowed the gates to remain closed for months. The space beneath the city was the leverage that enabled negotiations from a position of strength, not begging. The siege failed, and one of the conditions of the subsequent peace was the recognition of Nuremberg's privileges. The underground infrastructure literally bought the city political status. That is its true function, not to store beer, but to make power impossible to seize. And this explains why the underground cadastre in Taidung was maintained for 7 centuries, because it was part of a structure that sustained itself regardless of who sat in the town hall. And this explains why the official history referred to all of this as tombs. To call them tombs is to strip the objects of their political dimension, to turn instruments of power into utility buildings, to remove the question of who designed this and why. It works until you start to count, until you look at the depth of 70 meters beneath Bamberg and ask, why is such depth needed for sand? Until you look at the 400 rooms in Merseburg and ask, how many goods does a town of 3,000 people need on 4 levels? Until you observe the auditory passages of Erfurt and ask, how does a countermine tunnel hear whispers in the barracks? When you start to count, the version about food and beer stops working. There remains one alternative. Under these cities lay a parallel, invisible infrastructure of power, very well designed, and it still stands. But Mendig has another side that's easy to overlook. Exactly when the 3 square kilometers of cavities were excavated is not known. 18th century documents record not the construction, but the use of already existing halls. This is a crucial difference. It means someone created the system earlier, before written evidence appeared. The Celts extracted basalt for millstones. The Romans mined it for construction. Millstones made from Mendig basalt are found throughout Western Europe, from Britain to Egypt. Industrial extraction for centuries, with increasing production volumes. The only tool builders used was a hammer. A worker would strike a pillar and listen. A dull tone indicated a monolith. A ringing tone posed a risk of collapse. Acoustic diagnosis without formulas. And the system has stood for centuries without a single collapse. This is what specialists refer to as tacit knowledge, that which cannot be conveyed through text, only through hands and sound. It was not recorded in books. It would have vanished with the last master had it not been passed down continuously, generation after generation. Who held this chain of transmission? Who taught the next? This is not a technical question. It is a question about the organization that existed alongside any official structure and outlived them all. And there is one more question that experts on Mendig ask, but cannot answer. Where did all the extracted basalt go? 3 square kilometers of voids at a depth of 32 meters represent a colossal volume of solid rock that someone has removed and relocated. Millstones explain part of it, but the millstones made from Mendig basalt weighed between 20 and 500 kilograms each. Transporting them along the roads of the Middle Ages was difficult and expensive. Nevertheless, they are found in Britain, in Egypt, in Scandinavia, in the Black Sea region. This indicates the existence of a logistical network capable of regularly moving heavy stone items across Europe, long before the age of steam and railways. Who organized these transports? Whose ships carried Mendig millstones in their holds? No guidebook provides an answer to this question. When you build with a reserve, you are building for a future that you cannot yet see. No builder from the 14th to the 17th century could have known what would be needed by the next generations. But they laid the depth, strength, and autonomy with such foresight that the system became suitable for functions that its creators could not have envisioned. This happened too frequently and in too many different cities to attribute it to mere coincidence. It is the result of design thinking with a horizon beyond a single lifetime. The cities on the surface burned, were rebuilt, changed plans and owners. But what lay beneath them remained, quietly, in the dark. At a constant temperature, in waiting. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of what is currently happening beneath German cities. Some systems have been restored and are open.
Some are preserved. Some are buried, flooded, or locked away. But the basalt of Mendig has not gone anywhere. The vaults of Hera stand tall. The boundary stones of Zeitz lie 10 meters deep, bearing names that can be read. The salt cavities of Lüneburg continue to slowly subside. The sinkhole area expands every decade. The earth has not settled its score. It is simply waiting for someone to come and sort things out. That is why the final question of this analysis is not about the past. It is about the method. If you want to create an infrastructure that will survive a change of power, bury it underground. If you want to protect a resource from external control, place it where the controllers do not look. If you want to manage information, integrate acoustics into the architecture. If you want your system to function independently of what happens on the surface, make it autonomous. Provide it with its own water, its own entrances, its own logic. This is not medieval thinking. It is a universal principle. The fact that we find it in the cellars of the 14th century does not indicate that the Middle Ages were primitive. It suggests that the ability to conceal power where it is not sought is one of the oldest human strategies, perhaps the oldest. Under the German cities, it was realized in stone, in the forest, in basalt, in sandstone, at depths ranging from 6 to 70 meters, with boundary markers, cadastries, regulations, and acoustic resonators, with autonomous wells and secret aqueducts. All of this still stands. The earth has not returned what was given to it. And finally, about what this means personally for each of you who is listening right now. In any old city in Europe, in any historical center, there is something beneath your feet. It may just be an old foundation. Perhaps it's the remnants of medieval sewage. It could be a cellar that no one has known about for 100 years. Or maybe it's a part of a system that once served a purpose that official history remains silent about. Tourists in any of these cities are shown only a small part. The rest remains in darkness. It has been partially documented, mapped approximately. What exactly lies there is not fully known. Somewhere beneath the German cobblestones stand halls that haven't been entered since the 17th century. There are documents that haven't been read since the 18th. Boundary stones bear the names of owners that no one remembers. The land keeps what has been given to it, quietly. We live above history, literally, and much of it has never come to the surface. The question is not about finding evidence of a specific conspiracy. The question is about stopping the acceptance of official versions as complete. The version about the cellars is convenient. It closes the issue. It does not require an explanation for the redundancy, whether in depth, volume, or engineering. It doesn't require an explanation for why professional mining engineers were paid for beer warehouses, why the acoustics of a concert hall were calculated in a sewage collector, or why 40 kilometers of tunnels were dug beneath a town of 3,000 people. But when the same redundancy is repeated in 9 cities from different regions and eras, it is no longer a characteristic of an individual object. It is a characteristic of a system. And a system requires a systematic explanation. Its official history has not been revealed yet. Perhaps it's because it isn't being sought. Perhaps it's because it has been found, and the decision was made not to publish it. Maybe it's because the answer significantly alters what we think about the nature of power in the Middle Ages. Or perhaps it's because part of the documents that could answer this question still lies underground, where no one has looked for it. One obvious fact remains. We are taught to look up, at cathedrals, at palaces, at portraits of rulers, at what has been made grand and visible. The history of power that you were taught is the history of what stood on the surface. But what has been made invisible, hidden, and autonomous is another story. It is not written on paper. It is written in stone, at a depth of 6 to 70 meters, and it is much harder to read. Yet it has not burned. Beneath our feet are layers, and what we know about them is less than what is actually there, much less.